Good morning, everyone. Welcome to AWC webinar number 35. We're joined by Aliza from the WateReuse Association. Thank you for being here, Aliza.
Thanks for having me.
I wouldn't dare to pronounce your last name. My French is bad enough as it is, so I will leave it at that. Today, we are going to be covering wastewater reuse and reuse overall. For those of you that know me, I'm a big fan of water recycling and the reuse. I think there hasn't been enough focus on this particular industry. Everybody seems to pivot and start looking at desalination before they actually consider looking at what we already have and what we're already treating. So with that, I really love this subject. This is actually something that I see as kind of the future as we face some of these, trying to go after better water quality. So with that, these are some of the webinars that we've done. We're already at number 35. Wow, we've really gone through a lot of these. I encourage, if you've ever missed any of these, last week we were with Joe and we did some ZLD, some zero liquid discharge, and how there is no zero liquid discharge, but as close as you can to ZLD. A quick thing about AWC, of course, we've been around for 40 years. We design and manufacture both potable and wastewater treatment plants. We've been around for 40 years, of course, and we've got close to 600 plants worldwide. We divide everything into 3 categories. So we do everything that has to do with potable water, wastewater, and skid-mounted systems. And I love the fact that we're actually going into the water reuse, because we can actually touch on so many of these different technologies whenever you go into reuse. Quick little shout out to World Water Day. That was earlier this week, of course. The topic for this year was the groundwater, making the invisible visible. I love this little graphic. A lot of times we think of water just as, lakes and streams and everything that's visible. There's a lot of groundwater out there. And of course, focusing on the treatment side of things and making sure that it's potable and safe to drink is where we come in. So with that, we're going to get started on the wastewater reuse. Aliza, take it away if you want to share your screen.
Sure. Thanks so much, Alex. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all and open the discussion on water reuse. So as Alex mentioned, my name is Aliza Furneaux. I am a technical and regulatory programs director with the WateReuse Association. My background is in environmental engineering, and I approach this topic also with a passion. So I did my master's thesis on nutrient recovery, and then resource recovery just became a space for me that I was very passionate in. And so I had a research fellowship with the EPA following my master's, and then I came over to the WateReuse Association. So I'm so pleased to get to share just a little bit of an overview with you all about some of the water reuse opportunities that exist. Before I get started, just for those that are less familiar with the organization, the WateReuse Association is a nonprofit trade association, and we're solely dedicated to advancing laws, policy, funding, and public acceptance of recycled water. And I will note that I know this is more of an international audience, and we do have international members and we have an international reuse committee, but for the majority of kind of our focus and the work that we do, especially on the advocacy side, it is focused on the US market. And so a lot of what I'll be talking about is focused to the US. So I just want to forecast that for everyone, but we do have an international reach within our membership, and it is something we always are focused on and trying to incorporate and continue to grow. So, we're all here, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and it's been such an impressive lineup of webinars before me, and I just always want to set the stage of kind of why are we thinking of water reuse? World Water Day did just occur. I appreciate that kind of shout out. And I include this graphic here that many of you, I'm sure, are more than familiar with, and this is just our traditional way of thinking about water treatment. We have our drinking water, we have our wastewater, and this graphic is just demonstrating that kind of de facto reuse, and that in fact we're always reusing water. The water that exists is the water that has always existed. So here you can see, we're pulling out surface water, you're treating it to safe drinking water standards, you're conveying it to the community who's consuming it, and then the waste is we're treating the waste, and then we're releasing it to a surface water where it goes downstream for another community to take up and follow a similar process. And, when we think about water reuse, we like to think about kind of why we're approaching it. And for a lot of communities, it comes from a need base, it comes from that water quantity and water scarcity side. But for other folks, there's many other drivers. And so I never want to leave that out, but I always like to start here and just think about, how are we engineering and redesigning the way that we think about water? How are we getting more out of every drop of water? There's just so much to be done, and we've been kind of very successful with this traditional linear approach. But with water reuse and the technologies that continue to evolve and that exist currently, there's just a really good opportunity to bolster communities' water supplies and add some resiliency, especially in the face of accelerating impacts from climate change. And so when we think of the drivers, when we look at the map of the US, and this just is a broad map, you can kind of see some of our membership just for folks if you're interested. But historically, water scarcity is what is driving most communities to think about water reuse and incorporating it in some way within their community portfolios, within the industries that operate within their community. But that's not the only driver. So we always like to point out, the other larger driver that's kind of been growing in recent years is really nutrient limitations. So on the East Coast, parts of the Midwest and the Pacific Northwest, facing, the nutrient guidelines, limitations that are coming forward, reuse can be an opportunity to kind of abate that discharge. And so for some communities like Florida, they're being directed to eliminate their surface discharges. And so reuse is a tool, among others, of how they can kind of approach meeting those guidelines. And I apologize, that graphic is a little blurry, but that's just showing nitrogen stress kind of in groundwater across the US. There are kind of two other ones that are smaller and a little bit more niche, but still drivers for communities. So on the East Coast and some others on the West, saltwater intrusion into groundwater is often a problem. So in communities in Maryland and South Carolina, those communities are utilizing their kind of treated municipal wastewater and then injecting it to help create a barrier to prevent that saltwater intrusion. And the last one that's kind of the most up and coming, I guess, or kind of a forefront is how communities are thinking about historic communities with combined sewer. So if you have combined sanitary and stormwater, they're having these combined sewer overflows. And for some communities, as they can continue engineering, the gray infrastructure, the green infrastructure, and how they handle it, on-site non-potable reuse is becoming a larger topic. So in New York City, they recently are incorporating incentives for developers to implement on-site systems so they can reduce the strain on their centralized treatment. And what that really does for them is allow the continued growth of business and development without continuing to further strain their centralized system and adding to the CSOs and creating kind of those overflows. And so they're exploring this kind of pilot program right now and what impact on-site reuse can have for their CSO management. I don't want to just talk about the US because I think it's important to acknowledge that, internationally, countries have been doing this far ahead of just the US. And so this is just a table from one of the EPA kind of documents on reuse. And they're just demonstrating that the drivers also here historically are due to water scarcity, but some of these countries really have a lot of knowledge to share. And we as an association and through other kind of EPA initiatives partner with some of these countries to facilitate that knowledge like sharing and just recognizing that they kind of have a lot of lessons learned to share with us. But I always want to point out the drivers and the broad applications on an international stage as well. So when we think about why we're doing reuse, then we always want to make sure we're talking about the same type of reuse, because water reuse and water recycling and purified water, a lot of those terms can be kind of synonymous or interchangeable, but the way that we define it as an association is the intentional capture of a source water like wastewater, stormwater, saltwater, gray water, and intentional treatment meant for the beneficial end use. And so these are just some of the examples of end uses and end users that would be taking some of these recycled waters and utilizing them in some beneficial way. The main point and the key thing we always like to talk about is that treatment piece and making sure that it really is fit for purpose. So dependent on the source water you're taking and the quality, you're applying the appropriate treatment to protect public and environmental health for the intended end use. So that way, when we think about that linear approach, we can start to kind of craft and engineer this really circular water cycle. And we're doing it in a way that is safe and reliable. And so this is just a graphic, that demonstrates all the different ways that it can be used, but also that you're going to treat the water for different end uses differently. So you're not going to apply the same level of treatment, for potable, direct drinking water as you are to apply on, a park or to irrigate agricultural fields. And so this is just kind of what we like to think about, and that's our broader understanding and our big umbrella of what water reuse encompasses. And I pulled out just some examples, and these are going to be municipal wastewater reuse for different applications. But these are some of the treatment examples. There's not a one size fits all when we're thinking about reuse, because you're taking into consideration the source water, the end use, you're taking into consideration usually the state that you're operating in is going to have different regulations or guidelines, or it may be a case by case kind of permitting scenario. But I just wanted to demonstrate here, I have Virginia, Texas, California, and Florida, and these are just some of the combinations of filtration and disinfection and processes that they're using in these different facilities. I'm just going to dive deep into Orange County, but I am happy to share more information on these kind of other processes and talk a little bit more about their end uses if there's time, but I don't want to stick too closely on this. So this is Orange County Water District, and so they have a groundwater replenishment district. And this is a project, it was a $480 million project, a large project that was kind of co-funded by both the drinking water side and the wastewater side. And what they're taking their clean wastewater, and then they're going through microfiltration. And so you can see those images on the left hand there. That's kind of the above ground of the microfiltration. And then you can see the basement with all of the kind of technology there below. And then they go on to reverse osmosis. And so in that top photo, you can really see all of those RO membranes and just, how far they go back in that warehouse. And then that bottom photo just shows you the scale of this project. And then the final kind of way that they disinfect is through ultraviolet light and advanced oxidation. And then that final photo, they don't do direct potable reuse, so you're not actually drinking the water straight from this process, but as part of their demonstration and tour facilities, they have these great photos and kind of take you through to show you just what the treatment is doing and how safe it is. But this community's particular drivers in approaching this very large project was from a water scarcity point, but also from that saltwater intrusion. And so what they do with their water, they purify wastewater, I think up to 100 million gallons per day. And half of it is injected to help with that saltwater barrier. So they're injecting it strategically into wells to prevent the saltwater intrusion into their groundwater basins. And then the other half is transported, I think about like 20 miles away into different groundwater basins. And it is augmented, I think 75% purified water with 25% groundwater as they inject it. So it's augmenting their groundwater supply. And what they're able to do is really to provide and kind of offset the potable water needs of about 850,000 of their residents. So it's a massive project, but it's just a great example of, this kind of ingenuity and the drinking water and wastewater side coming together and coming up with a project to address their specific needs in the community. And because I don't have time to go into other examples, touching on how industry is using this or how ag is using this, I just provide this example and I link to it later on so folks can check it out. But, reuse is so much more than just municipal reuse for a drinking water application. Those are just some of the more developed projects, and I wanted to be able to have some great photos to show of the technology and treatment. But this graphic, I would recommend folks just refer to and see what else kind of exists under this water reuse umbrella. Same thing here, just so you all have it in perpetuity. These are some great resources of case studies. So if you're just getting started in this space, or you want to learn about what other communities, how they designed, how they got community support, a lot of these resources kind of dive into that and just touch on the technology a little bit more than I'm going to today. And so I would be certainly remiss if I did not talk about how in the US water reuse is regulated, because it really does impact the market. So if you're kind of a consultant engineer, or you're working at a utility and your community is interested in coming up with alternatives to bolster your water supply, there's not going to be a federal regulation to refer to or to comply with. And so in 2012, EPA established this set of guidelines for water reuse, but that hasn't been updated since then. It is a great, very comprehensive document. But right now, the posture of the federal government is to not regulate at the federal level. So what they've been doing and the way that they've been engaging with reuse in the past few years is through this National Water Reuse Action Plan. And what they've done is built some staff capacity. So they now have 4 or 5 full-time employees focused on water reuse, which we, from our perspective, that's great, because previously it was just, folks that were interested within other offices, but now there's this dedicated team working on water reuse and trying to advance it and make sure communities that are interested are able to do this. And so this action plan has this online platform that just goes through a series of actions, not just EPA led, with many stakeholders, international partners, and they cover topics, policy and regs, of course, but also the research roadmap, science and specifications, communication materials. So if you're interested in reuse, even internationally, I recommend checking out this online platform because it's just such a database of resources, information. You can see what's going on with different partners in the water sector, because each action has a list of, milestone 1, and has it been accomplished, who's working on it, who you can contact to find out more information. So it's a really powerful tool, and that's the extent of federal kind of involvement in the US. And so the rest is really left up to the states. And so if you're looking to develop a project in each of these states, it's going to be fairly different, and especially depending on the end use. So these maps just demonstrate, which states are even have regulation or a guideline on the book. And they're vastly different between each of the states, and they all have different kind of regulatory processes. So some states are much further along in terms of potable reuse. So California has these draft kind of regulations out. Florida had that state bill that kind of is eliminating surface water discharge. So it's not requiring reuse, but it's requiring an elimination of discharge. So it's pointing towards utilities coming up with their own plan of how they're going to implement reuse. And Colorado is kind of very much in their draft phase of coming up with some regulations. And so, if you're going to approach water reuse from this perspective, the regulatory structure definitely impacts how you're thinking about it and what your options are of how to take a source water and then apply it for an end use. And I think just keeping an eye on the time, I'm just going to quickly wrap up here. I want to leave it, I started in a kind of complex and confusing area with the regulations, but I want to leave it on a positive note. At the association, we really think there's a bright future for water reuse. As Alex mentioned, I think it's really like we're thinking about how we're utilizing water. We want to, be efficient with what we're doing, want to make sure that it's safe and reliable. And we want to make sure that there's going to be water that has good quality and quantity for generations to come. And so we like to highlight these industrial areas, and we did conduct a market assessment with Bluefield Research. And, their 2 kind of largest areas of growth were in industrial and commercial reuse, and unsurprisingly, municipal wastewater reuse. And so we do a lot of work in municipal wastewater, but as an association, we're really trying to grow our membership and grow our resources to support that industrial and commercial reuse. And so I'll just leave it there. I'm really thankful to speak to all of you. I'm happy to answer any questions. And I'll just note, if you've got really specific technical questions, I'm happy to connect you with the right expert, but that probably won't be me. So I'm happy to answer the questions and connect you where it makes sense. So thanks so much, Alex.
Excellent. Thank you, Aliza. So I'm going to switch over to my screen here real quick, make sure I'm doing this right. So before we open it into the questions and answer stage, and please go ahead and do so in the chat box, or don't be shy, go ahead and turn on your mic and your camera. I wanted to highlight something that Singapore has done. I'm in no way endorsing New Water. It is a part of the Singapore government kind of program they have. But what's interesting is when we look at water recycling or water reuse, there's always been an ick factor, especially when you go into potable water. Irrigation, maybe not so much. Industrial process water, I guess is somewhat acceptable. But what Singapore came out with, and it was kind of a, marketing venture on their part, was we're going to get water, recycled water. And number one, we're trying to be independent because they were actually importing all of their water. I believe it was from Indonesia and Thailand. So first of all, we're going to try to be water independent. And number two, not only are we going to be recycling our water, but we're going to make it a cool thing. So you would have seen this is not something that they're hiding. They're not trying to, do it where it's just a plant that nobody knows where your water is coming from. It was actually in your face. They had tours, they had videos and everything, and showcasing how we're doing it, the process that we're doing it. And when I saw this, I was like, wow, this is, they're light years ahead as to where we're going to be. And I saw in your slides there, Aliza, that you were mentioning a lot of them, you're actually getting it and doing an aquifer recharge rather than actually going straight to potable use, which is interesting, which I guess I agree with. If that's the easiest way to do it, I guess that'll work. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight how they do it in Singapore. From what I understand in Israel, I might add to that, on the international front, they recycle about 82% of their municipal wastewater. It's very high, 82%. It is all used for irrigation, but the fact that they can do it at 82%, they've got the technology, they can do it. They've got a really good business case for it, means that it can be done, and there's no reason why we couldn't adopt it here. It is very geographically targeted in Canada. Thankfully, on the West Coast, we have a lot of water. Actually, we have companies here that are dewatering companies. They're not trying to recycle water. They're trying to dewater it just because it almost gets in the way in construction and the mining industry. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and open it up for some questions. There's Aliza's contact information there if you have any follow-up. So I can go ahead and open the floor for any questions. You can put them in the chat box. While we wait, I do have a couple questions of my own, and so here they go. I was working on a project in Oklahoma where we were using some oil and gas water for reuse, and we were using it for irrigation. And we had the hardest time finding the right target, the effluent target that we were trying to hit. I noticed that you had a couple links in there. Does Oklahoma have a guideline, or is it more of a strict regulations? Because I don't believe there are federal regulations for irrigation. Is that right?
Yeah, no, there's not federal regulations for that. And I think Oklahoma would be on the guideline side. And I know for oil and gas, under that RAP initiative, that's one of the sources they identified as needing some more research to help states create regulations, basically. And so there's the New Mexico Consortium of Produced Water, and that's academics and the regulators and the kind of industry as well. And they're partnering to do some research to understand and figure out the best way to regulate that. And then I think there's also an assessment of each state's specific regulation on oil and gas. So I can provide that link as well. So I think that, and that's done by the Environmental Defense Fund, I believe, but they just did like a raw assessment of the states, but there is not a federal kind of regulation on how we're using or reusing produced oil and gas water.
Okay, yeah, because it looked like there was layered. First, you have to start with your, the state, then you go into the region, then you go into the basin where you're discharging the water. Fine. Then you have to actually take a look at what industry it's coming. If it's coming from oil and gas, you might have to meet a very specific effluent standard. If you're coming from, pulp and paper or mining or municipal, then each one. So by the time you drill down to it, nobody could give me, I spent 2 to 3 weeks chasing this down, and nobody could give me an answer where, okay, there's a list, meet these guidelines, right? So, yeah. Okay, we have a question here coming in here. It says, any comments on emerging contaminants in the context of reuse?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just like the rest of the water industry, if you're drinking more wastewater, it's a concern, and it's something on the regulatory side that we are tracking and working with our members on. I know, if you're thinking of treatments that exist to remove, obviously not destroy the PFAS, but to remove PFAS or PFOA, like an RO microfiltration is going to be one of the higher kind of removals of that. And so for states that are encouraging that level of treatment, so like in California or just some other communities that have done that because they're focusing more on closer to direct potable reuse, I think that those seem to be, and from what I hear from our experts, in kind of a better suited position, which is encouraging to hear. But I think that's something that, we've got to keep an eye on, the same as all of the drinking water facilities, of making sure our treatments are effective in kind of following those guidances. But right now, the regulatory processes for PFAS and PFOA, they're kind of still developing them. And so we're always in close contact with EPA and making sure we're kind of engaged in that and getting the information out to everyone who's interested or working on reuse related to PFAS.
So I had a question on the membranes. I know that membranes came up a few times. So I'm not the biggest fan of reverse osmosis. I mean, there's a place for it, but a lot of times it's just kind of used as just throw membrane on it and you're done. Um, do you see on either the regulations or policies where reverse osmosis is kind of the final barrier that will be used in most reuse applications?
I think really the only context that it's kind of communicated as the final or really recommended or almost needed is California. I don't know that other states haven't quite taken California's in a copy and paste kind of way. They always look to California, and California does so much research with their California State Water Board on the log removal of pathogens and which treatment is providing that kind of removal. So I know they use them, but I think the only state in my awareness is California so far that's kind of recommending or going to be requiring the certain types of treatment.
Well, I think I've mentioned we did a job in California for water reuse, and they're looking for 6 log reduction, which can be done, but of course it comes at a cost, and there's a lot of different areas that you have to do as far as staging. And we finally achieved it, but I think California has kind of set I don't want to say the standard because that's giving them way too much credit, but has set a very high standard, anyways, to try to do that. So with that, I don't see any other questions coming in. Oh yes, I had a last question on my list. Okay, so what industries do you see where water reuse is going to be a little bit more focused on? Like, where is the potential future growth for, industrial wastewater?
Yeah, I think one of the big ones that we talk about and those kind of fleshed out in that market assessment are companies in kind of IT and data centers and food and beverage, because a lot of their drivers are really by their environmental sustainability goals. And so those goals now are really pushing folks. And so we're working right now with Google. So they're trying to convert some of their campuses and their newer campuses to incorporate on-site non-potable reuse. And that's just from the perspective of wanting to meet their water goal and water conservation and also kind of their impact on the community. And so that's one that is really bearing out on that kind of the side, but on the more heavy industrial side, pulp and paper was a big one that came out surprisingly. And apparently, as it was explained, we've all been at home, we've been ordering more. So while we aren't using newspapers and kind of that material as much, we are using a lot more cardboard. And so that industry is growing and it's very water intensive. So that was another one they're like, that's going to be big. And of course, oil and gas, but you've got to figure out the right regulations and how we're gonna move forward with that. But that's always one that's another big industry.
Yeah, interesting that you mentioned the pulp and paper. As we have this big move against plastic, obviously in favor of recycling, against plastic, well, you still need a container. You still need to put the food, the carryout, whatever it is you're ordering, in something. So that's kind of where it's moving to paper. And I'm actually not personally against it because at least you can, recycle paper. It's easier to recycle paper. There's more of a circular economy around that. So, okay, with that, thank you very much, Aliza, for your time. If anybody does have any other questions, you have her email address or you can give me a call. Please do. Thanks again. With that, I am going to do a last little plug here on our YouTube channel. If you've missed any of them, please make sure to have a look at them. Rachel would have put a link in the chat box, and please subscribe. With that, thank you very much, and I will see you again in 2 weeks. Goodbye.